Alright, welcome, students. So, toward the coming of Christ. So, in our last lesson, we talked about when we left off with the Maccabees rebellion. So now we're going to be connecting the dots from the book of Maccabees until the until the birth of Christ. So, let's talk about it. So, the Maccabean rebellion pitted the smaller Jewish army against the much larger and more impressive Seleucids. And through a variety of miraculous victories, the Jewish people were able to secure their independence. And this came to lead to the rule of the Hasmoneans. Now, these were interesting because they were non-Davidic rulers. Now, Mattathias, the high priest of Israel in 166 BC, began the resistance against the Seleucid persecution. The leadership of the Hasmoneans is then taken over by his son Judas, or Judah, depending on if you prefer the Greek or Hebrew pronunciation, Maccabeus. And he led the military resistance from 166 BC until his death in battle in 160, defeating armies of immense size. Jonathan, Judas's brother, led Judah in a powerful position during a Seleucid crisis in 152 BC, which began with the death of Antiochus IV. And this allowed the Jews to gain rights and privileges. However, due to Jonathan's own power within the Seleucid Empire, he made many powerful political enemies and eventually got himself assassinated in 143 BC. It came to his brother Shimon, or Simon as we pronounce him in the West, the younger brother of these two men, who finally declared Judah's independence in 141 BC. This would touch off a little less than 100 years of Judah ruling itself once again as an independent kingdom. So from 141 BC until 63 BC, the Hasmonean dynasty ruled Israel. Now, little is actually mentioned of them in Scripture, but we have other historical sources to attest to the fact that they existed and what it is they were up to during those years. So, mainly these were campaigns within the kingdom to destroy idols whose temples had been built during the reigns of the Seleucids and other rulers. And this came to be done mostly by military force. The temple was reconstructed once again, and the priesthood enjoyed a high societal position. Many of the emissaries that the Hasmonean kingdom would send out to the wider world were of the priestly class. We also see the emergence of new religious sects within Israel. And these are the Qumran, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Hasidim. And there were controversies about this period. So what were the controversies? The first is the merging of the crown and the high priesthood. Even as early as the reign of King Saul, it had highly been understood that the high priesthood and the office of king were two distinct offices. You had a high priest who was concerned with the care of the temple, the reading of the scriptures, and matters of religious law. And then you had the king, who was a military leader. He was the political leader. And so there was this line. The Hasmoneans themselves were both high priests and kings, and for many they viewed this as an improper merging of the offices. The other issue is that they were non-Davidic. Remember, they took control of Judah, which had a long tradition that the monarch must always belong to the house of Judah. The Hasmoneans, despite being kings, at first they did not call themselves king. For example, Jonathan and Shimon used the title of ethnarch, which means ruler of the people. But Simon's kids were pretty quick to take up the title of king. And finally, there was this issue of their Levitical lineage. In order to be a member of the high priestly class, you had to show descent from the tribe of Levi. And it was not clear. There were internal disputes about, were they really of unbroken Levite descent or not? So we end up with a community that gets divided into 6 distinct sects, 6 distinct different religious communities. And during the life and times of Jesus, we actually will get to see some of these people. So the Pharisees are one of these camps, one of these groups of Jewish people. And the other major class were the Sadducees. And their main difference concerned the question of life after death. The Pharisees did believe that the soul went on living after death, whilst the Sadducees denied it. The Zealots were those who opposed any and all foreign rule or intervention, often with violent means. It's widely suspected that Barabbas, the murderer who was released by the crowd in place of Jesus, was likely a member of this sect. He was likely one of the Zealots, since in many of the biblical passages he's referred to as a murderer, but alternately as a revolutionary. So it's very likely he was a member of the Zealot class. Hellenizers were the opposite of the Zealots. The Hellenizers supported the adoption of elements of Greek culture. They wanted the Jewish community to become more Hellenized, to join the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean in being more Greek. Most of the Hellenizers would eventually fade out and would eventually kind of join the pagan religions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Then we get the Essenes. We don't know much about them. They lived in isolated religious communities in the wilderness, and some people believe that they were the models that many early monks looked to for how to structure a monastery or a hermitage. Were they related to the Hasidim, those who viewed themselves as incredibly righteous and set apart from the rest? It's unclear if they were related to them or not. It was very clear, though, from what writings we found of this, they had apocalyptic concerns. They believed the world was ending soon. So we get this sectarian divide that emerges in the time leading up to Jesus. In one section, we have the Pharisees. And their sect, strictly speaking, comes to an end in 70 CE with the destruction of the temple, as does the Sadducees, although they would eventually end up forming a lot of the basis. Many of the Pharisees would go on to found the basis of modern-day Judaism. Just let me pause this for a moment. You've paused to take a look at this. Let me continue. So, the Pharisees either go one of two directions. Many of them become end up becoming the basis of modern Judaism. A few of them, however, a few of the Pharisees become followers of Jesus of Nazareth and eventually split off from rabbinical Judaism and become part of the early Christian community. There are some Gnostic forms of Judaism and Christianity that proliferate and decline. The Sadducees also fade out, although there's some influences on later Judaism and Christianity, but not as much. The Essenes, it's not entirely known if they ended with the destruction of the temple or if they dissipated later. But some of their more monastic practices may have had influences on later Judaism and Christianity. The Zealots are not doing so great. They're badly defeated in the First Roman-Jewish War that we're going to talk about next class. And they reassemble for the Second War, and they pretty much are entirely wiped out after they lose to the Romans a second time. The Hellenizers are ultimately squeezed out by competing Jewish resurgence, the emergence of Christianity, as well as movements like Gnosticism and Mithraism and other religions. So the Hellenizers just kind of disappear. They kind of just fade out over time. And this is where we are with these communities around the time that Jesus enters the picture. So the Roman conquest... Oh, too fast. The Roman conquest. In 63 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus conquered Judea. Now, the reason he's able to get away with this is because of the struggle between two heirs. there's Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. And this granted the opportunity for him to do this. So what happened basically was one of these young men, Aristobulus, held control of the crown. Now, John Hyrcanus II was his brother and a rival for the throne. John Hyrcanus ends up approaching Pompey. Now, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was probably one of the most successful military geniuses of his era. And one of the things that he did so well was he had actually been sent in to deal with another king elsewhere known as Mithridates. Mithridates Tigranes. You don't need to know his name, but anyway, he defeats Mithridates, who'd been a major problem for the Roman Senate, and then he just decides on a lark to take over what's left of the Seleucid Empire. He does it, and then he's making his way down through the Seleucid Empire towards the coast, and he bumps into Prince John Hyrcanus. And Hyrcanus says, hey, look, I'd be a better king than my brother. Could you come down with your large Roman army and help me claim my throne? And Pompey takes one look at this kid and says, yeah, this is going to be easy. So he does. And he chases Aristobulus II out. Now, while Rome and the Hasmoneans had enjoyed an alliance from the year 160 through to the beginning of the 1st century, in the midst of the 1st century, Rome saw the Jews as yet another Eastern Mediterranean power that had to be conquered, especially as they were gearing up for war with Parthia, the emerging Persian Empire, and Rome wanted to secure the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, or our sea, the Roman lake, as they sometimes called it. So, this leads into what's called the Herodian dynasty, which was founded by a man named Antipater, who, along with Hyrcanus II, was given ruling powers by Julius Caesar in 47 BC. Antipater would later end up responsible for the death of John Hyrcanus II. In 140 BC, Parthia invades, and Antipater's son Herod fled to Rome, where the Senate gave him an army to retake Judea. Herod ruled as a king under the Romans from 37 BC until 4 BC. Herod's holdings were divided between Antipas, which included Galilee and Perea, Philip, the Golan Heights, and Archelaus, who inherited Judah. Archelaus was removed by Rome in 6 AD for misrule, and they placed governors in charge of his territory. During this time, the temple is reconstructed, but the Herodians are non-priestly kings with no ties to the Davidic dynasty. So at this point, Rome is now in charge of Israel. So what happens next is, now Rome goes through a few periods in its own history. And these periods are a monarchical period from 750 BC until 500 BC. A republic, which reigns from 500 BC with the expulsion all the way up to 27 BC. And of course, an empire, which reigns from 27 BC to 456 AD in the West. So this is really where we're going to leave off right now.